I almost feel like we could just go home. But that's because I know what Daniel 7 means and you don't. And so the work can't be done until the work is done. And you probably noticed as you turn with me to Daniel chapter 7 that it gets a little interesting. And I'm thankful that you haven't left yet because there is as beautiful of truths in this rather difficult text as you will find anywhere. I need to set this up for you real briefly here. You'll notice in a careful study of this, verse 1 in the first year of Belshazzar. And so what that means is that Daniel now in chapter 7 has gotten out of order. Where this event would have fallen in his life would be between after chapter 4 and before chapter 5. So you just need to be aware of that. Daniel is no longer the young man that he once was. He's now in his mid to late 60s. He's been in exile now for decades. And you'll notice as well that if you read the book of Daniel, that up until this point, other people get dreams, and then they call on Daniel and Daniel's God to interpret the dreams. Now, Daniel's going to get a dream, and he's going to need to go to God's angel for its interpretation. So that's interesting. This sort of literature that we read here in Daniel 7 is called apocalyptic literature, literally meaning it would literally be rendered revelation. So that's why the last book of the Bible is called that, revelation, more specifically revelation into the unseen realm. Oftentimes, and we need to be very careful of this as Christians, we forget, and certainly if you're not a Christian, then you don't probably know that not all that is there can be seen. And so this idea of a secular materialistic humanism by which all that there is all that can be seen could not be farther from the truth. There is way more unseen than there is seen. And so God gives Daniel, and specifically for Daniel, for God's people, a vision into the unseen realm. Now, the interesting thing about a vision is that it's and you'll see here, he saw a dream and had visions. It's like you're watching a movie. And so I'm going to treat Daniel's vision in three scenes. And we'll move through these scenes one at a time, and then we'll let Jesus have the mic and tell us what the majority of it actually means. Now, when we read this earlier, especially in the first 8 verses, you're probably thinking, what in the world is going on here? And so was Daniel. So Daniel, in verse 15 of Daniel chapter 7, as for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. That's a slight understatement. Like, it's alarming reading it, let alone you're the guy that gets it. So, verse 16, I approached one of those who stood there, one of the angels who stood there, and I asked him the truth concerning all this. So like, hey, angel, what does all of this mean? So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of the things. Verse 17, these 4 great beasts are 4 kings who shall arise out of the earth. Okay, so that tells us what's going on with the 4 beasts. But in the angel perhaps sensing Daniel's anxiety, and the angel knowing the storyline of the world, says, but the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever. One more time, forever. And one more time, and ever. So already within the anxiety that Daniel feels, he goes to the angel. The angel says, here's what's going on with the 4 beasts. And by the way, God wins. And when he wins, his people win. And they win forever, forever, and ever. So with that understanding, because if I were to just launch in here and start telling you what the beasts mean, you'd be like, where's he getting that from? I'm getting it from the Bible. It's amazing actually how often the Bible will help sort itself out for us, and yet careful study is required. And so we turn our attention then to verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote them down. Verse 2, Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. Now, you have to remember that sea is in the Old Testament most often evidence of chaos and of judgment. And it was thought of that way in ancient history as well. The sea is the place of chaos, and the winds from heaven blow upon the chaotic sea. Verse 3, and four great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. So scene 1 of this movie that Daniel is in a sense watching in his mind, and now we are going to watch along with him. Scene 1 is the beasts oppose. Scene 1, the beasts oppose. So the wind blows on the chaotic sea. Out of the sea, four great beasts come up, different from one another. Now we already know because the angel told us these are four kings and four kingdoms. So here we go. The first beast, verse 4, beast number 1, is in verse 4. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. So he's like a lion, but he also has wings. And as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. So this beast, now if you go back and read chapter 2, Daniel has a dream, King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream in chapter 2, and in the dream in chapter 2, Daniel interprets it. You can go read that. That interpretation from chapter 2 helps us with the interpretation of chapter 4. So I just want to say that, but I'm not going to go into it, so you can go read chapter 2, and then you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. This first beast is like a lion, and it has eagle's wings. This beast is Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar. Babylon, and specifically King Nebuchadnezzar. It's King Nebuchadnezzar because of the fact that the lion represents a king. There's actually been found in archaeological digs in Babylon a lion with eagle's wings. And you'll notice that this king who rises up, he has these wings, but his wings get plucked off, and then he's lifted up from the ground, and then he's made to stand like 2 feet on 2 feet like a man, and then the mind of a man is given to it. Now, if you know the story of Nebuchadnezzar, you know that one of the things God does in judgment of him is brings him low and then restores him back to his position. And so scholars agree this is, and I agree, this is first beast, Nebuchadnezzar. Second beast, verse 5. Behold, another beast, a second one, like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, arise, devour much flesh. So beast number 2 is a kingdom, and that kingdom is the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, because of the benefit of history, we know that God's judgment on Israel was Babylon, and God's judgment on Babylon is the Medo-Persian Empire. And so God is going to use the Medo-Persian Empire, beast number 2, with the ribs in his mouth, to go and devour beast number 1. We keep reading, verse 6. Beast number 3. After this I looked, and behold, another like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After the Medo-Persian Empire, again from the benefit of history, there is a guy you might have heard of called Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great. Took him about a decade to conquer the entire world, basically. Ferocious like a leopard with the speed of a bird. But not just 2 wings, 4 of them. This homie can fly. And so that's exactly what Alexander the Great did. He absolutely, after the Medo-Persian Empire, he just comes through and just dominates everybody. Dies at the age of 32. We don't know why. And then after that, you know what happened? His kingdom is broken up into 4 regions under 4 kings, potentially hearkening to the idea of this leopard having 4 heads. Beast number 4, verse 7. Now you'll notice that beast number 4 gets more time. We'll see why in a moment. After this, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, terrifying and dreadful, exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it. It had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. The next worldwide dominating power after Alexander the Great would be the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire comes and is more dreadful than the first 3 beasts. You'll notice toward the end of this, and this is just what happens with apocalyptic literature, is that you have this beast. It's terrifying. The descriptors are there, and then it has these 10 horns, and then out of those 10 come one, and then that one is the most fearful of the horns. And then toward the end of the verse, you get this idea almost of like this horn being personified. It has eyes like the eyes of a man and a mouth speaking great, and as we'll see, blasphemous things. So the fourth kingdom is the Roman Empire. If you go back and run that through Daniel chapter 2, that's exactly how that goes. And this fourth beast is more terrifying than all of the other ones. Now, there's been much debate around who this little horn is that we see in this fourth beast. Perhaps it was Nero, and to me that seems like a very, very compelling argument. Nero was as wicked and blasphemous of a human as you will ever find. Perhaps there's a sense in which it's more forward-looking to the end times Antichrist, or perhaps to some degree both. Okay. So scene 1, you have these 4 beasts that rise up out of the chaotic sea. All 4 of them stand in opposition to God. The fourth beast is more terrifying than the first 3 and speaks with its mouth great and blasphemous things. Which brings us to scene number 2. As I looked, scene number 2. So scene number 1, the beasts stand in opposition. Scene number 2, God wins. As I looked, thrones were placed. So I don't know how well you can get into this. I'm inviting you to really get into it with your imagination. Daniel has this vision. Here's these 4 beasts. They get progressively stranger and more terrifying. The fourth one is really, really terrifying. And then out of the corner of his eye, he switches and he takes up another scene. And the next scene is thrones being placed. This is a heavenly courtroom, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000 thousands served him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. So this Ancient of Days figure is interesting. Again, this is a judicial hearing right here. The thrones are gathered together. Court is in session. This Ancient of Days figure, I'll just tell you, God the Father, he's a pure and ageless judge. That's the idea of his hair and his clothing. He's a pure and ageless judge. He rides around on a chariot. That's the idea of his throne. Like his throne is on fire. It has wheels of fire. Chariot language likely. He rides around on a chariot that's on fire but not being consumed. And he has a flamethrower coming out of his mouth. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. And so this figure of this Ancient of Days is a very, very interesting picture. So pure and ageless judge riding around on a chariot that's on fire with fire streaming out from before him, fire meaning judgment. And he has an innumerable host doing his bidding. The books were opened. And I looked then, verse 11, because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. So now the scenes are colliding. The little horn, whoever that figure is speaking like he's in the middle of a sentence. And as I looked, the beast was killed. Like the Ancient of Days, when he's decided he's had it with the little horn running in his mouth, he doesn't even let him finish his sentence. He just kills him. Like it's rude, but that's what he does. He just kills him. You don't even get to finish your sentence. I've listened to you long enough. You are now dead. And then he was killed, and his body was given over to be burned with fire. He was flung into the fires of the judgment of the Ancient of Days. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. Their lives were prolonged. Their dominion is taken away. Their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. It is as though God, speaking to Daniel and by extension to God's people through Daniel, says to Daniel through verse 12, "Dear Daniel, I win God." Dear Daniel, I win God. Dear Daniel, the four beasts that rise up are frightening and powerful, and they speak blasphemous things, and it appears as though they are in control, but I am actually in control of them. I win. And I just wonder if, as you watch the events of tomorrow's news cycle, which I might encourage you not to do, but you will, I wonder if you might invoke the imagery of the Ancient of Days, seated upon his throne in judgment over all the earth, ageless and pure and wise, riding around highly mobile on a chariot of fire with judgment ushering out before him. And when he wants the blasphemy to stop, he just stops it. And when he wants to throw your dead corpse into the fires of his wrath and judgment, which he does to the beast, he just does it. And there is no one in heaven or on earth who can stay his hand. And he has an innumerable number of an angelic army that does all of his bidding, and no one comes before him but by his own bidding, that Ancient of Days on that throne in the midst of tomorrow's news cycle. Scene 1, the beasts oppose. Scene 2, God wins. Scene 3, God's agent of salvation. I saw in the night visions, I'm back in verse 13, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. There came one like a son of man. Now, son of man language is interesting because it's not the first time we see it show up in the Bible. I think what this is a reference to is Psalm 8 and verse 3. Let me read it to you. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given dominion over the works of your hands, and you have put all things under his feet. Psalm 8 verses 3 to 6 is where son of man language in Daniel 7 is coming from. And that's hearkening back to the creation account, where God creates this glorious world with its heavenly hosts and all of these things, and then God places the pinnacle of his creation, let us make man in our own image, into his garden, and then he gives to man dominion over the beasts of the field and the birds of the air, to where all things are meant to be under man's feet. Of course, you know that then man sins and loses that dominion, and everything has been on a path of needed restoration since then. Here in Daniel chapter 7, you have one who is like the Son of Man. So he's like him in that this is a man. But as you will see as we continue, but this man is no mere man because of the fact that this man receives glory and honor and worship, which means it seems as though he is a man and he is also divine. It's worth noting that this Son of Man will exercise eternal dominion over the beasts. So in one sense, he's like Adam, only better. this Son of Man comes to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. Verse 14, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom. Dominion and glory and a kingdom. That all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. It's interesting to notice, and I don't think you've seen it up until this point, the thread by which God's sovereign rule and reign runs all the way through Daniel chapter 7. It's worth noting back in chapter 3, back in verse 3, that it was the winds of heaven that blew on the chaotic sea. That means God did that. That it was God's hand who plucked the wings of the first king. It was God who made him stand up, and it was God who restored his mind to him. You'll notice as you read about the next beast that someone told it to arise and devour much flesh. That was God. You'll notice as you continue reading that dominion was given to the third beast. It was not Alexander the Great's military prowess primarily that was the reason for his dominion. Dominion was given to him. And it was under God's sovereign permission that the fourth beast arose. And it was under God's sovereign permission that the fourth beast spoke his blasphemy. And when God the Father, the Ancient of Days, decided no more to the fourth beast was no more. It was God the Father who gives to this Son of Man an eternal dominion and glory and a kingdom. God is sovereign over all of these things. So you notice then, under the divine sovereign hand of God, that the Son of Man is going to do three things that we see in this text. Number one, he will dominate his enemies. He will absolutely dominate his enemies. God does not care that the little horn is powerful and scary. God does not care. He does not seem to care that the little horn, whoever this figure is, Nero, Antichrist, maybe both, is in the middle of a sentence. When God decides to snuff him out, that is exactly what he does. You notice in verse 18 of Daniel 3 that the saints of the Most High receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and ever. That is because of the fact that the Son of Man achieves an eternal salvation. He, number one, dominates his enemies. Number two, he establishes his eternal kingdom. You will notice that the kingdoms of the four beasts rise and fall under God's sovereign hand. The Son of Man's kingdom lasts forever. I don't know when the last time was that you thought about Alexander the Great before this morning. Probably not that often. Now that's really interesting, because at one time, he basically ruled the world. Like we're trying to get our mid to late 20-year-olds to just go get a job and move out of mom's basement. That dude's out dominating the entire world. That's what he does. Some ambition on this guy. Dominates the entire world, basically by the time he hits 30, the story is told that when he finishes, he weeps, that there is no more world to conquer. And yet, he dies at 32. And then his kingdom, they fight about it, and then it's split into four. And the fact of the matter is outside of a history book, you never think of him anymore. This king, this Son of Man, who establishes his eternal kingdom, this king lives forever. He has to, because his kingdom and his dominion lasts forever. And so remember when the guys come to Nebuchadnezzar last week, and they're like, "Oh, king, live forever?" This one actually does. This one actually does. This one has actually achieved worldwide domination, and he will live forever. Number three, this king, this Son of Man, receives worship from all peoples. He receives worship from all peoples. That's middle of verse 14. All peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. And so it is that you have this idea of, yes, he is like a son of man. He's like Adam, only better, but he's also divine in that he receives worship from peoples, from every nation, tribe, tongue, and language. Now that was all just the introduction. So, we have to ask ourselves this question. We do not ask it very often. We need to ask it more often. We have to ask ourselves this question. I mean, the series is, right, I think the title of the sermon is Jesus and the Son of Man, so you're probably on to me. But we have to ask ourselves, who does Jesus think and say that he actually is? Because there's a lot of people who want to speak for Jesus and say, well, Jesus thinks this and Jesus says that. Who does Jesus actually think that he is? And I'm going to let Jesus answer that from Mark chapter 14. So you'll turn over there with me, please. Mark chapter 14. With all of that vision from Daniel by way of introduction, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man in Mark's gospel something like 12 or 13 times. Just to spare myself the email, more than 10. He refers to himself as the Son of Man more than 10 times. I think it's 13. More than 10. And there's this really common understanding around Jesus invoking Son of Man about himself in Christian circles that goes something like this. Jesus is a man, and he wants to emphasize that he is a man. Therefore, he calls himself a Son of Man. I understand how you could come to that conclusion, but that's why we need to read the Old Testament, because Jesus, when he calls himself Son of Man, is not emphasizing his humanity. He's actually emphasizing his divinity. Additionally, there is this line of pretty poorly thought out apologetics against Christianity, skepticism, that your freshmen in college will probably run into if they go to a secular university, that basically says Jesus never claimed to be God. So Jesus never claimed to be God, and then our 19-year-olds or 18-year-olds are going, oh, he didn't? No, he never claimed to be God. He called himself a Son of Man. He never called himself Son of God. That's how the story goes. And then our 19-year-olds go, oh my goodness, if Jesus never claimed to be God, then that means Jesus didn't think he was God, and that means my entire worldview just comes crashing down. Listen, it doesn't need to. It doesn't need to. Because Bart Ehrman and other really intelligent guys want to make the claim Jesus never called himself God, but they are mistaken. And I want to show you that from Mark chapter 14. This is very near. I know you remember this because we preached through Mark like 3 years ago, but this is very near now the end of the life of Jesus. He is before the council of the chief priests and the elders and the scribes. They have been trying to kill Jesus for a very long time. The trap has finally begun to spring now on Jesus. Now remember, up to this point in Mark's gospel, anytime somebody would come and be like, hey, I know who you are, he would go, shh. Hey, you're the Messiah, shh. Hey, you're the Christ, shh. Because he doesn't want his identity getting out, because Jesus, yes, is the Christ, and he is, yes, the Messiah, but he has come not to rule and reign upon a throne on this trip, but rather to die on a cross. And so he is not having anybody coming and trying to take him as their king yet. And so up to this point, he's always said, shh. But now standing before the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes, they, I think, paid some false witnesses off to come and make accusation against Jesus, but the false witnesses either were really dumb or didn't get paid enough because they couldn't get their testimony to agree. So it's not going very well for the high priests. So then finally, verse 60, the high priest, I'm in Mark 14, stood up in the midst. He's like, I gotta take care. I gotta get in control of this because you you idiots can't agree on anything. So, what is it the high priest says? Have you no answer, verse 60, to make? What is it that these men testify against you? But he remained silent. Like a sheep before its shearers, he gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ?" Said another way, "Are you the sent one, the Son of the Blessed, the Son of God?" And Jesus said, "I am. And you will see who's that? The Son of Man. The Son of Man, seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And the high priest absolutely blows a gasket, tears his garments, which is the universal sign at that time of blasphemy, and says, "What further witness do we need? You have heard his," what's that word? Blasphemy. To which Jesus could have said, "Listen, bro, I don't know why you're overreacting. Son of Man, I'm just saying I'm human." Except for he's not, number one. And number two, the high priest is not hearing him say he's just a human. You know why? Because Jesus and the high priest and Bart Ehrman and you and me need to be more familiar, like Jesus and the high priest, with the Old Testament. Because when Jesus calls himself the Son of Man and says, I'll be seated at the right hand of power and I'm coming on the clouds of heaven, the high priest, in the middle of blowing a gasket, locates that back in Daniel 7 and goes, hang on a second. He's claiming to be God. So let's kill him as a blasphemer. Now, of course, it would be blasphemy if he wasn't God. And you might wonder if, in fact, he is God. I'll simply submit to you that after describing ahead of time the way in which he will die, he then dies under the wrath of God and then rises from the grave 3 days later. That puts him in a category all by himself. Jesus thought he was God, which is why he invokes Daniel 7 Son of Man imagery. Hey, church, Daniel 7 is about me, Jesus, because that's exactly what he's doing. He then dies under the wrath of God as he predicted that he would, and that he rises from the grave 3 days later, also like he predicted that he would. You take that body of evidence and you go, that's God. So Daniel 7 is ultimately finding its fulfillment in Jesus Christ. Jesus thought that, the Son of Man, Jesus thought that, the high priest saw that, the Bible points to that, which means, turning back to Daniel 7, verses 13 and 14 of Daniel 7 find their ultimate fulfillment and are pointing forward to the resurrection and ascension of Jesus Christ. In other words, Daniel is not only getting a frightening vision of beasts who stand in opposition to God. He is getting that. But he's not only getting that. He's not only getting to peer behind the curtain of the heavens and see this Ancient of Days figure who is not threatened by opposition, and when he wants it to be done with, it will be done with because he sits in judgment over all of the earth. He's not only seeing that. He's also seeing a glimpse forward from his view in redemptive history where the perfect Son of Man, yes, a man, but also God, comes into the world, lives a life that we could not live, dies the death we deserve to die, rises from the grave, and is presented before the Ancient of Days as the one who has sufficiently paid for the sins of his people in order to redeem them. And then upon that glimpse of the Father to the Son, all authority in heaven and on earth, an eternal kingdom, never-ending dominion and glory is all bestowed upon the Son. And there's a degree to which one day, but in that moment also, but one day in its fullness, he will receive worship from every nation, tribe, tongue, language, and people. So Daniel 7, yes, has some weird stuff in it, but you have to see the beauty of the Son of Man ascended back to the Father. Two things about that Son of Man, and we're done. First, Jesus you might notice, has come to save his people rather than to destroy them. Now, I say that because what you see is an eternal domination of his enemies. And you might also notice that born under the wrath of God as we are, and born sinners as we are, because we are in the first Adam who forfeited dominion over the beasts and over the earth because of sin, we are born enemies of God. Unpopular notion though it may be, it is nonetheless true and biblical. We are born as enemies of God. And yet, in the kind, sovereign grace of the King of glory, he does not destroy us, but rather offers us salvation. And he's offering that to you this morning. Number one, he has come to save his people rather than to destroy them. Number two, after securing the salvation of those people on the cross, he then sends those people out as heralds and ambassadors, vice regents of the King. I've reminded you often, do not speak the Great Commission unless you include the part that comes before the instruction. The instruction of the Great Commission is go, but the part that comes before that is the way in which we're able to go, and it's this: all authority, these words are read, by the way, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Why? Because I'm the eternal Son of Man. Because I have died and risen from the grave. Because in my dying and my rising, I have unequivocally destroyed all of my enemies. So all authority in heaven and on earth, even over death, has been given to me. And then he says to his disciples, and by extension to his church, and if you follow him, then he speaks this to you: now go into all of the world and tell them about me. And this is the great joy and calling of the church in our day. We are sent out by the King. We say a message something like this: the King has come, and rather than destroy all of his enemies, he chooses to die for them, submit to him. The King has come, he is here, and he will return. You might say it like this: he came in flesh at Christmas. He occupies by his Spirit now in this age through his church, and he is coming again on the clouds, and when he does, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that he is Lord. And those people that he comes to redeem will worship him in his presence and in the presence of the Ancient of Days forever and ever. And so to prepare for that, let's think about this. Now to him, doxology according to Daniel chapter 7. Now to him who has triumphed over the beast and sits at the right hand of the Ancient of Days, who has secured the salvation of his people from every nation, tribe, and tongue, to the divine Son of Man and Ancient of God's salvation, Jesus Christ, be majesty, glory, dominion, and a kingdom that never ends. Father, we praise you that you are sovereign over all things and have done this for your people through your Son. Jesus, we thank you that it would have been right of you to destroy us rather than to save us, and yet you took the punishment and the destruction on the cross that we deserve so that we can have the life and the favor from God the Father that you deserve. Spirit, if there are those under the sound of my voice, or perhaps here listening to this recording later, who have not yet bowed the knee to the King of Glory, would you give the gift of faith and open blind eyes, take hearts of stone and replace them with hearts of flesh, throw off any hope of anyone to save themselves, and rather call sinners to fling themselves upon the mercies and grace of the Son of Man, Jesus Christ. Father, as it is your will in this moment to keep your Son seated at your right hand for perhaps another minute, or perhaps another year, or maybe another 1,000 years, would you keep your church? And Father, we're just simply claiming the promise that you've given us. Would you keep us a faithful bride? And would we be bold and courageous in these difficult days, with chaos around us and chaos inside of us of sin and all of this? Would we be a faithful witness going into all the world with the authority of the King who is the Son of Man, Jesus Christ, and proclaiming his death, his burial, his resurrection, his imminent return, his rule and reign over all enemies? And God, would you use us in that message to save many, and to see an increase in the number of the nations, the tribes, and the languages gathered around the throne singing, "Worthy is the Lamb"? Would you use us as a church to see an increase in that number for having us have the neighbors and the family members and the co-workers that you have sovereignly placed in our lives? We pray these things in the name of the King of Glory, the Son of Man, Jesus Christ. And the church said,